So imagine you are a detective, but instead of solving crimes, you are cracking secret codes hidden within books, movies, and even everyday life. Today we are going to talk about that secret magnifying Sherlock Holmes lens, which will reveal all the patterns and connections that make everything tick. We are going to take a trip down the rabbit hole of language, culture, and society. It's like exploring an alternate dimension where words, ideas, and even social norms have hidden codes. We will start with a guy called Sassure and explore his basic ideas. Finally, we will look into how literary theorists have analyzed fairy tales, myths, and other cultural phenomena through this magnifying lens, or should I say, X-ray vision of structuralism. In a broader sense, is to see the world in terms of structures. Now, what are structures? When you were studying mathematics in your early days, you had this chapter on triangles and then squares, right? So triangle is a structure, square is a structure. But when you look at a building, do you see a square or just a triangle? No. You see it as a combination of different geometric shapes, which you have studied as units. So basically, this entire world around you, which you can physically see, is built up of smaller units. When you were studying biology, you were taught about cells. When you were studying physics, you were taught about atoms and molecules. So these are the building blocks of either living things or elements. And therefore, we are somehow always open to the idea that a larger thing can be actually perceived as a collection of smaller things. But an element is not just the atoms that are present in it. You are not just the cells that are present in your body. You are actually the connection between the cells. In chemistry, you are taught about these different kinds of bonds between atoms and molecules, right? So these bonds, these connections are not just part of physical universe, but also intellectual universe. What is intellectual universe? When you look at the world and it makes some sense to you, okay, you're looking at a sunrise, you're looking at a sunset, so that is making some sense to you. Why? Not just because there is a sun, not just because there is a sea in front of you, but because there is a perceiving mind which is making these connections. And therefore, our gaining of knowledge depends on not just what we are supposed to know, but also how we are supposed to know this. So, understanding anything doesn't only mean you have to understand the units that make that thing up, but also the rule by which those units are put together. Since this is a class on literary theory, we will first focus on the linguistic element of structuralism, and then we will focus on the literary theorists who have applied the core concept of, let's say, linguistic structuralism to anthropology, to literature, to mythology, and so on. When we talk about language and structuralism, the first and foremost figure that should come to our mind is that of Ferdinand de Saussure. The pronunciation is tricky. You will get a hang of it once you say it a number of times. Saussure was a linguist, and in order to understand his point of view, we need to understand how people usually study language. When you are a linguist, you have two options in front of you to study any language. One is the diachronic approach and one is the synchronic approach. Don't worry, they are very easy ideas. Let me explain them to you. Diachronic means when you look at language, let's suppose any language, Sanskrit, English, French, when you look at and study any kind of language, keeping in mind how that language has changed over time, its history, its evolution, the way books like Otto Jespersen, they present the study of language. That approach is called diachronic approach. It's like watching a movie. It has a beginning and it has a movement through time. So that is diachronic approach. What is synchronic approach? Synchronic approach is, suppose the movie is going on, but you take a screenshot or a snapshot of one scene. So that snapshot approach is called a synchronic approach, which actually doesn't talk about why that language at that point of time has become like that. It only focuses on one single point of time and how that language is evolving meaning or generating meaning. Let me make this clear. Synchronic approach doesn't only mean the present. It can also mean past. Suppose you are a linguist who is taking up the synchronic approach and you want to look at medieval English or Middle English period English language. Then your approach should be what was the grammatical structure during that time, how were the connections between nouns and verbs and adjectives present during that time. Your approach will not take into consideration what was happening before medieval period and what was happening after medieval period, because you are looking at a snapshot at one point of time or a very short period of time. So that is synchronic approach. So that only bothers with the grammar of one particular moment in the development of a language. So the way you were taught English in school, that approach is that of this synchronic style, you can say. You were taught things like parts of speech, noun, pronoun, adjective, then voice and narration, direct, indirect. So all these things form the structures, the codes, the rules through which you had this idea of English language. So for you in your school days, English language had one set of rules, one standardized shape, and your job was to see how these structures were related to each other. But as you grew up and you opted for English honors, now you have realized that English language is not a stagnant language. It has been changing over time, evolving over time. And the study of English language as a moving thing, this is the diachronic approach. All right. Now for Saussure, we have a synchronic approach here. He is looking at language as a set of collection of different units. Now, when it comes to language, let me ask you a simple question. What is the basic purpose of language? Communication. And what is the basic criteria of communication? Generating meaning. If you do not generate meaning, then you are not communicating. So language, communication and meaning, they are so very interlinked with each other. Now, is this connection between language and meaning fixed, standardized, or is this random? Let me give you a very short and cute demonstration. Pongo, come. Okay, so now I want you to closely observe this four-legged animal which is sitting right here. Okay, now you observe his reaction. Okay, Vasco da Gama, hippopotamus, giraffe, khabe. See, when I said khabe in Bengali, it actually means, do you want to eat? Now this is a Bengali dog, so he understands khabe. And see how he gets alert. Now, the point of that demo is to make you understand that this word, this short little sound that my dog responded to, I mean, the connection is very arbitrary. Why does this dog react in this way? Because when it was a child, when it came to my house during the first few days, I repeatedly used this word and then gave him a treat. So he associates this word khabe with treat. And whenever I use this expression, he looks at me. So how does language acquire meaning? Through repeated use. And of course, through acceptance by many people within that system. So the connection between word and its meaning is basically not fixed, not logical, but arbitrary. If I had trained this dog using some other word, giving him the treat, then the dog would associate that word with eating. Sassure, he gives a very interesting idea in the form of the system of signs. Now, in order to understand the sign system, first we need to know what he means by the two words langue and parole. In any language system means, say, the English language system, the Bengali language system, the Hindi language system. In any language system, there are a set of rules, conventions, approaches which people accept as universal, as normal, and that set of conventions, that set of rules is called langue. You can call it the grammar in a very loose sense. But when a person uses that language, suppose now I am using the language English. I also use the language Bengali, Hindi at times. So when I use that language to make my personal utterances or to write my personal writings, personal in the sense whatever I write is a personal writing, personal utterance. Maybe it's an academic answer which I am writing. Even then that belongs to my expression. Okay, that is my expression which I am giving off. That is called parole. P-A-R-O-L-E. So langue is a set of rules. Parole is how that rule is used by an individual to make some kind of communication. It can be written, it may be verbal, or even sign language. Alright? So langue is universal rule, universal in the sense, so far as that language is concerned. Universal rule, set of rules. Who made these rules? These rules are not made by any one person or any one grammarian. These are accepted rules. Accepted by whom? By a larger chunk who speak that language, who write in that language. Therefore, langue gives you rules. Parole is your way of using those rules to create your expression. Alright, now we come to the more tricky part here. When I am using langue through parole, that is when I am using grammar to create literature or to speak, to express myself, then I am using words. Why am I using words? Because words have certain meanings. But how are those meanings fixed? As we just saw in that cute little demo, the relation between word and meaning is not logical. The four-legged animal that was sitting here, that is called a dog. It is also called a kutta in Hindi. So what is the connection between the word D-O-G, dog, and this animal? Nothing. Because if it was logically connected, then everybody would call it a dog. An Englishman would call it a dog, a Bengali would call it a dog, a Chinese would call it a dog. No. Because within the language system of English, this might be called a dog, but within the language system of Bengali, it's called a kukur. So, when you are using the word dog, you are using a word. But in Saussure's terminology, this is called a signifier. Signifier means anything which gives off a certain kind of signification. That is, it is asking you to think about something. And whatever you end up thinking about is the signified. So when I say dog, you think about something, that idea is the signified. So the four-legged animal that was sitting here with me, that is the signified. But the word dog is the signifier. Okay, how would you remember which one is what? Signifier means doer, doing something. So the word dog is doing something. What is the word doing? It is asking your brain to conjure up this image of a four-legged animal which can bark. So this word is doing something, signifying something to you. So it is a signifier. And the image inside your brain is the signified. Okay. So signifier is like this light which is falling on you, and signified is the image that is formed in your brain or mind because of that light. Alright. So this is signifier and signified in very basic terms. If you want to be a little more technical, you should call a signifier as a sound image. So DOG, it can be spelled out as dog or it can be written down. When it is written down, it's of course kind of an image in front of you. And when you are saying it out loud, it's like a sound which is hitting your ears. So signifier may be a sound image. Forget about language. When you look at the red light in a traffic signal, how do you respond to it? If you're walking, you stop. If you're driving, you stop. In any case, you stop. When there's this green signal, you just go. But think about it logically. The color red, like if you put a red colored cloth in front of this mad bull, it would chase even with a greater might. So definitely red doesn't necessarily mean stop, right? We have red in our blood, which means it is a very vital sign of actually going on. So red is not necessarily connected with stopping or stagnation. On the other hand, if you think about the color green, it generates an idea of peacefulness, serenity, like you're taking a nap, you're stopping. But the green light in traffic signals, they indicate that you are ready to go. So red, stop, green, go. How are they logically connected? They are not, at least not in our minds. But there are scientific explanations to it, that the red light that can be actually seen from a greater distance because of its wavelength. So if you want some vehicle to stop, then that indication must be sent across a greater distance than if you are asking the vehicle to actually not stop. And therefore red is used as a standard color for stopping vehicles. But when you are actually in a traffic signal, do you actually think in those terms? No, you just see red and you just stop, because you are culturally tuned to stop when you see a red light in a signal. Similarly, when there are two doors and you see the stick figure of a woman on one door and stick figure of a man on another, what do you make of it? You understand two things. First, the door where you see the image of the woman is reserved for women and the other one is reserved for men. Although human beings don't look like those sticks, but you associate that. And the second thing and more important thing is that you understand that these are washrooms, although nowhere is it written. Why? Because you are used to these kinds of signs all through your life, so you know instantly, looking at the two doors, that they are washrooms. So the connection between signs and how they are interpreted, that is dependent on cultures. A person who is not exposed to these systems will not be able to understand if these are washrooms or not. Maybe they can still figure out that one is for men and another for women, but they will not be able to actually guess that it's a washroom. So the relationship between signifier and signified, the image and what you're thinking of it, that is arbitrary. The closest word to arbitrary is, random. There is no actual logic behind it. If I give you the word more, what does it mean? It means of a greater quantity, right? Not necessarily. I didn't say I'm giving you an English word. In Hindi, more means a peacock. Shore in English means a seaside. Shore in Hindi means great noise, loud noise. So in order to understand what a word actually means, we have to first understand which language system does it belong to. Is it a Hindi shore I'm talking about, or English shore I'm talking about? So it's very important to understand the context in order to understand the real meaning of a word. And this is the primary idea of structuralists who come after Saussure. Now, if you talk about the relevance of structuralism in context of literary theories, we will have to understand a little bit about three, I would say, pillars of structuralism after Saussure: Claude Lévi-Strauss, Vladimir Propp, and Roland Barthes. What these people do, they extend the idea of signifier and signified from the field of linguistics to the field of culture studies. Nowadays, cultural studies have become the in thing, but back then in 1950s, 60s, 70s, this was coming up as a very important aspect of theory. First, let's look at what Lévi-Strauss was doing. French social anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, he applied these ideas, especially the idea of langue and parole, to things like mythology, kinship relations, and even food preparation. You have heard people saying that I have prepared this recipe for you at lunch. But the problem is, we make a very basic mistake here. When you prepare food, you don't prepare recipe. Recipe is the set of rules which you need to follow to prepare that dish. So you don't prepare recipe. You prepare dish according to recipe. Recipe is langue, dish is parole. Recipe is the set of rules, therefore grammar of cooking. And what you end up cooking, it might not be exactly what the recipe is about. You can make mistakes, you can even excel, you can experiment. So how you are negotiating with that recipe is what you prepare as your dish. So this is Claude Lévi-Strauss's idea here. Now, when he talks about myths, Lévi-Strauss uses a very interesting approach. He says that myths are fantastic, arbitrary, of course, because mythologies are fantastic things, aren't they? But he says that mythologies across different cultures are basically similar. Now, we have this feeling or notion that mythologies of, say, Russia are different from mythologies of West Bengal, which are different from mythologies of North America, which are again different from mythologies of Scotland. What Lévi-Strauss tries to tell us is that they are not inherently different, and actually there is some inbuilt connection between them. In order to establish his point, he says that all mythologies, irrespective of which culture it belongs to or which timeline it belongs to, mythologies can be actually broken up into small units, and he calls them my themes, which he presents as the smallest meaningful units in any myth. According to Lévi-Strauss, every culture can be understood in terms of certain binary opposites, like high, low, birth, death, inside, outside, and no matter how differently located cultures are, the way in which mythologies make sense is essentially the same. Mythologies create these contrary ideas in a very similar way. Lévi-Strauss was drawing somewhat from the ideas of Hegel, especially the idea about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But that's a different discussion altogether. We are not getting into that now. What Lévi-Strauss did was he showed that these opposing ideas, they fought against each other, and even they can be resolved, as in marriage, in mythology, in ritual. So this is Lévi-Strauss. Coming to Barthes, Roland Barthes, this gains an additional dimension. Now, one thing you will have to keep in mind, structuralism is not it's not a voluntary, conscious movement where theorists, they participated and said, let's be a structuralist, and they partied together. No, it's not that. If you are to identify structuralist elements in any theorist or in any theory in general, you will have to understand that these people, they were scattered through the globe, and sometimes they didn't even agree with each other on various points, but they derived from each other certain sense that everything can be broken down into smaller components. So whoever, acting as a literary theorist, tries to break up any text into smaller units, or which may be rearranged to completely change the meaning, is actually being a structuralist, because that person is focusing on the structure of the text and not on the context or history or evolution of the genre or such things. Now, what Barthes did, he drew from Saussure mostly the idea of langue and parole, and how a generalized system exists based on which individual paroles are created. He tried to emphasize the point that text is more than just a linguistic exercise. It's like a cultural phenomena. How a text generates meaning is basically because of a cultural activity that it undergoes. And he actually defines structuralist approach as an activity. What kind of activity? And he actually says this: the structuralist activity involves two typical operations, dissection and arrangement. It's a translation from Barthes. So maybe he didn't exactly say these words, but in English it would mean dissection and arrangement. Dissection is when you cut something up into smaller pieces for better comprehension, for better understanding of its components. So when you have a text and you are a structuralist, you will dissect the text. Okay? And then what will you do? You will rearrange it in a way, and you will also look at the arrangement of those parts. What I was telling earlier, that the units are not meaningful in themselves. They are meaningful because they are connected to each other, and this connection makes everything tick. Okay? So here also Barthes is saying the same thing. He is saying that the arrangement is our focus. And this is important because he kind of brings in the era of post-structuralism in a way, and he goes on to where we reach Derrida eventually, that this arrangement, since this arrangement is the key, therefore a little bit of rearrangement makes have a change in the way the text means. So we can say Barthes belongs to the second stage of structuralism, and he was evolving from it in a way, although his basic idea stems from the idea of Sassure. So Barthes, on one hand, he, just like Ferdinand de Saussure, he constructed these charts, creating a cluster of terms, but his approach was less rigid than Saussure, or even Lévi-Strauss for that matter. When you hear about Roland Barthes, many of you have heard the expression death of an author. It's as if Barthes is saying that the authors have all died. No, he is not saying that at all. He says that once a text is produced and is made available to the readers, the author loses the relevance to produce any meaning. How does a text produce meaning? Well, every text, because he's a structuralist in a way, every text can be broken down into components, or as he calls them, codes. And the arrangement of those codes in the text generates meaning because they are part of a larger setup. What larger setup? When a book is published, it is not published in vacuum. Already many books have been published into that cultural system. So when a book is published and it contains certain elements, people read that book, they identify those elements, and they unconsciously link those elements to the previously written books. I'm not talking about history here. I'm talking about the meanings that are inside your head, generated already by all the books you have already read. So it is producing, you can say, a milieu, a kind of atmosphere in which meanings are created by previously existing arrangement of codes. I'm calling a book an arrangement of codes, like Barthes. So when you read a new book, you are judging it based on those meanings which are previously imprinted in your mind. For example, in Indian cultures, snakes do not have the kind of sinister significance as you have in case of cultures governed by the Bible. Therefore, if you encounter a book where you see something happening, where you see something snake-like, you don't associate it with devil automatically if you are only well read into the books belonging to the Indian cultural system. But if you are a hybrid reader like me, then these two systems, they again get rearranged in your mind, and then you generate meaning of that text. Whether to consider the snake as evil or devil, or whether to consider the snake as the ornament around Lord Shiva's neck. Similarly, ideas like death, all these things are so very differently understood by different cultures. Why structuralist approach is limited? Because we are at a juncture where all these cultures are blending into each other. So these codes, they are getting all rearranged in very random ways. So the kind of authority that structures had, they are getting destabilized. So this is the basic idea of post-structuralists. So we will deal with that in some future video if we take up the topic of post-structuralism. Now, before going towards the end of today's discussion, I want to discuss a little bit about my very favorite structuralist, that is Vladimir Propp. He's my favorite because he deals with fairy tales and I love them, don't you all too? Now, just like Lévi-Strauss, Vladimir Propp also said that no matter how different fairy tales across different cultures appear, they are essentially governed by the same patterns and set of rules which he calls functions. He actually lists 31 functions. And he says that in any fairy tale, no matter what its country of origin is, in any fairy tale, you can identify these 31 functions, and based on which functions are focused, the fairy tale becomes a certain kind of fairy tale. Okay. Now, I'm not reading through the all 31 functions. You can see them on your screen, and if you want, you can take a screenshot and look at them, or you can pause the video. So, we have listed for you the 31 functions given by Vladimir Propp, and I'll just explain one or two to make things a bit clear. look at point number 2, function number 2, it's called interdiction. Interdiction means in any fairy tale, you would notice there are instances where the hero, he is forbidden from doing something. Don't do this. Don't go there. Don't eat this. Even in the Bible, a devout Christian would not call Bible a fairy tale, but the Bible has elements of fairy tale in it, doesn't it? And if you are not a Christian person, then you would obviously treat it as a mythological book, just like Christians would treat the Ramayana and Mahabharata as mythologies. Therefore, we can say that ideas like number 9, mediation, a helper is sought. Usually, in every fairy tale, you would notice that the central character requires some help, and then you have this first donor, number 12, where the hero is given a magical agent or a helper. And all these things happen mostly in the same sequence as this is written. It ends with a wedding. The hero marries the princess. Now this is very patriarchal, I know. There might be some mythologies or fairy tales in future where the central figure is a woman. In fact, nowadays you can have these web series, especially animated ones, where you do find women characters emerging as heroes of fairy tales. But usually, Propp was writing about Russian fairy tales in mind, and he saw that this is also relevant to fairy tales belonging to other cultures. And if you somehow apply these 31 functions to epics, you would see that there is an uncanny similarity between fairy tales and epics based on these structures. So what I want you to do is you think about your favorite fairy tale. Can be Cinderella, can be Snow White, or can be any Indian fairy tale. I would actually ask you to think about some fairy tale that belongs to your own culture and see if Vladimir Propp's 31 functions apply to it or not, or how many functions apply to it. And then you would notice that it can happen that a fairy tale doesn't contain all these functions, but it does not contain anything other than this. And based on the arrangement of these functions, the particular fairy tale has the particular effect. So you can say it's like a permutation and combination of these functions through which the meaning of a fairy tale is generated. Whether a fairy tale is about the importance of courage, importance of wisdom, importance of love. So that angle is provided by the fact that some of these functions are highlighted, some of these functions are, not so expressly highlighted in the story. So when you come to Propp, you would notice that he is going towards the application of structuralism on narration, how a story is narrated. If you are a budding writer, knowing about these 31 functions would give you kind of guideline on which to walk to make your own stories, because every story is a fairy tale after all. And therefore, in a way, we can say that Vladimir Propp is more like a narratologist. Okay, he's talking about structuralist narratology. And when you talk about structuralist narratology, that means how structuralism applies to theories of narration, theories of producing a text as narration. The other two names which I really feel they should be mentioned today, one is, of course, Gerard Genette, and the other one is Todorov. Genette is very important if you are to understand the application of structuralism on elements such as voice in a narrative, and then ideas like implied author, implied reader. So maybe in future we can have one or two classes on structuralist narratology, and if you are in the UG or PG level, maybe just a mention of these names would suffice, but then if you are interested, we can always have that discussion. The point of today's class is not just to give you any particular definition of structuralism, to give you any handouts where you can just mug it up and write in your exams. Today's point is to enable you to look at texts as codes that can be decoded. Okay, so next time you look at a book next time you read a poem, or even listen to a song, watch a movie, and like something about it, then try to understand which are the elements that make that movie, that book work for you. And then you would understand that these elements are basically your favorite elements which had been there in other books which you have liked. So therefore, one book, one movie is not produced in isolation. Rather, I would say it is not received in isolation by a reader. When you are receiving anything like a book, a movie, a song, you are a receiver who is already conditioned by your culture, who is already aware of the different meanings that exist for those units. Alright? So, being a structuralist means you should be able to understand that meaning of any text or any expression generates not from history or background of the creator or family life of the director, but it rather is created by whatever is contained within the text and the connections that are there between the different elements, and these connections exist within a cultural context. So, I'll see you all in my next video. I hope I was able to clear some of the doubts that you had regarding structuralism. Do let me know in the comment section whether you want any more videos on literary theories. Until our next video, stay subscribed, stay happy. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off, and you were watching Feminism.